They called her a monster, but tonight, she gives birth to a revolution. In the shadow of a shattered moon, where chains once defined worth and silence masked pain, a child is born not from conquest, but connection. Her mother, once sold as less than nothing, now stands at the center of a galaxy that cannot look away. And as the stars lean closer, she lifts the child high and dares the universe to try and stop what's coming next. Because this isn't just a birth, it's a war cry, wrapped in lullaby. The sky over Arca Prime pulsed with oily green clouds, low and bloated, like the breath of some dying god exhaling its last poison across a broken moon. Beneath that choked twilight, the market writhed. The air shimmered with the heat of too many bodies packed into too little space, and the scent-salted meat, scorched metal, and something far older hung thick in the lungs, like regret. Rows of cages stretched like ribs inside the iron lungs of the trade yard, each one humming with the energy of containment fields and desperation. Creatures of every origin clung to cold bars, eyes dull. Hope drowned long ago in this place that sold bodies like weapons and dreams like debts. At the farthest end, where even the dust didn't bother to reach, stood a single figure. She didn't cry out. She didn't beg. She simply was monolithic and still chained to a reinforced post, bolted into ferrocrete that had seen centuries of blood. Kazira. 3 meters of cobalt sinew and silent defiance. Her skin shimmered with violet undertones, not from design but from pressure wounds, never given time to heal. Golden eyes stared straight ahead, neither pleading nor defying, just watching everything rot. The crowd avoided her like a black hole, glancing and recoiling, whispering and sneering. Too big, useless, can't breed. What a joke. She'll break anything that touches her. And then, the laughter. The cruel kind, the kind that only exists in places where no one believes in mercy anymore. That's when he appeared. Not announced, not grand. Just there cutting through the murk like a blade. A man. Human. Taller than most, but plain. Dressed in threadbare explorer's cloth that had been patched more times than it had been washed. Dust on his boots, scars on his knuckles. He carried no weapon, wore no armor, but there was something in his eyes like a storm that had been caged too long. Draven Hallow. Some called him a xenobiologist. Others whispered darker things, that he'd seen what lay beneath the skin of worlds and chose silence over sanity. He walked past screaming deals and desperate eyes, past slick merchants hawking silk-skinned courtesans and venom-laced pleasure breeds. He didn't look at the product, he looked at the ground. His fists were tight, and then he stopped. In front of her, the crowd's laughter faltered. The merchants chuckled again, uncertain now. The seller, a lizard-faced brute with oil-slick scales and too many gold rings, slithered forward, eyes bulging in amusement. "You serious?" he hissed, tongue-flicking. "That one's a malfunction, friend. Look at her, built like a cargo loader. Can't even take a male without snapping him in half." Draven said nothing. "She's a waste of protein, barely tamed, refuses orders, too big too, broken." Draven looked up, not at the merchant, at her. Kazira. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. His voice came low, steady, like iron cooled in snow. "She's not broken, your system is." The silence was instant. Then the merchant let out a wheezing laugh. "Oh, that's rich. You want her, fine. No refunds, no returns. She bites your spine out, that's on you." Draven reached into his belt. Instead of a cred chip, he produced something ancient shroud, metal, heavy. A handful of earth coins, tarnished and worn by time, real currency from the forgotten past. No one used them anymore. No one had in 100 years. They clinked into the merchant's claw like relics dug from the bones of civilization itself. "Deal," said Draven. The merchant stared at the coins as if they'd bitten him. A signal was barked. Chains were released. Locks hissed open. A guard, shaking visibly, unlocked the cuffs around Kazira's wrists. The heavy metal hit the ground like a war drum, and she stood. The full height of her shadow swallowed Draven whole. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her gaze swept over him like a predator judging the twitch of prey. Waiting. For the blow. For the order. For the trick. But he said nothing. Just stood there, breathing the same air she did. Her voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, like stone dragged across stone. Why? He met her gaze, those impossibly ancient eyes. Because they forgot to see you, he said. I didn't. Something shifted. Not in her muscles, not in her chains. Something deeper. A tremor not of fear, but of confusion. The kind that lives just before hope. The dangerous kind. And as they turned him leading, her walking beside him, not behind the whispers began. He bought her? That one? He's insane. No one can. She's not even usable. What's he planning? But their voices grew quiet. Because the ground seemed to tremble under her bare feet. Because the broken thing refused to bow. Because somewhere in that market of filth and screams, something ancient stirred behind Kazira's eyes. Not rage. Not submission. But a question. What if I am more? And as they vanished into the violet haze beyond the gate, the last thing anyone saw was not the chains left behind, but the way her shoulders scored, bruised, monstrous began to rise. As if for the first time in her life, she had room to breathe. The room was small, too clean, too quiet. Outside, the cold metal of orbit hummed in a low, constant, throbbing artificial heartbeat echoing through the walls. The windows were shielded, closed to the black void outside, and within the confines of that sterile space, a storm crouched low in the corner. Kazira hadn't moved in hours. She was folded in on herself, knees to chest, arms coiled tight, back pressed into the wall like she was trying to disappear into it. Not hiding, watching, not resting, coiled. The kind of stillness that belongs to predators moments before they spring. But there was no prey here, just dust, silence, and a man making tea. Draven sat at the far end of the room, hunched over a flickering tool lamp, hands occupied with the bent internals of a scouting drone that had seen better centuries. His face was unreadable. No twitch of fear, no curiosity. Just patience measured in the way his shoulders stayed low and relaxed. In the way he didn't glance at her, not even once. He brewed the tea without speaking, not out of avoidance, but because silence, in its truest form, is louder than most truths. The scent of herbs drifted between them, unfamiliar to her, sharp and earthy, with the faintest sweetness beneath. It curled toward her like something alive, unthreatening, uninvited but soft. Her stomach growled. She ignored it. Instead, her golden eyes drilled into his back, searching for the inevitable. The trick, the demand, the mask slipping. That's how it always went. But it didn't. He simply fixed things. Machines, quiet, focused, like she wasn't even there. And that unnerved her more than any collar, any command, any chain ever had. You don't want to use me? She asked at last, her voice a jagged thing born of too many years in silence. Draven didn't look up. He adjusted a lens, clicked it into place. Then, without turning, he said quietly, "Number." Her claws curled against the floor. Then what are you waiting for? He paused, not in thought, but in decision. And then he turned. His eyes met hers not with challenge, not with pity, but with something far more dangerous, recognition. I'm waiting, he said, for you to believe you deserve more. Her breath caught. Something inside her trembled, not with fear but with dissonance. That answer didn't make sense in any language she knew. It didn't fit the script burned into her skin, etched into her marrow. The words were wrong. Or maybe she was. She straightened a little, just enough to rise from a crouch into something less animal, more uncertain. Her eyes narrowed. You think this is a game? You think I'm stupid enough to fall for a kind voice in hot water? I think, he said softly, you've survived too long to still be calling that survival. She stood. The ceiling barely cleared her head. Her mass filled the room like a shadow that had grown tired of hiding. But Draven didn't flinch. Not when she took a step closer. Not when the light shifted against her muscles, coiled with old tension and half-healed bruises. Not even when she loomed directly in front of him, gold eyes burning. You bought me, she growled. Don't act like you didn't. He nodded without shame. I did. She leaned in, voice low, venomous. Then why haven't you taken what you paid for? Because, he whispered, you're not for taking. And in the space between those two breaths, between predator and prey, something fractured. Not in her. In the pattern. This was not how it went. This was not what she knew. This wasn't the cold hand that gripped her throat. This wasn't the cage. This wasn't the hunger. This wasn't them. It was something else. Something worse. It was choice. It was not knowing what came next. That was more terrifying than pain. Kazira pulled back, slowly, like a tidal wave withdrawing from shore. She returned to her corner, but not in defeat. Not even in rage. There was a flicker behind her eyes now, small and furious. Not trust. Not yet. But the absence of certainty, the cracking of routine. Draven returned to his work. The drone whirred to life, sputtered, and then spun its internal gyros with a gentle hum. He didn't look back at her. He didn't need to. Because that night, for the first time, she didn't sleep with one eye open. She didn't sleep at all. She watched him. She watched the way he moved, the way he waited, the way he never reached. And she wondered if this was another trap. Why didn't it feel like falling? Why did it feel like breathing? And that question, hanging unspoken in the dark between them, would do more damage than any chain ever could. She didn't mean to speak, but the words were already there, building behind her teeth like a scream too old to echo. It came out rough, half whisper, half accusation. They called me a mistake. Draven didn't look up. He adjusted the solar coupler in the drone's core, fingers steady, as if this moment wasn't something fragile about to shatter the air. A body too large for any male, she added. Too much of everything. They said I was built wrong, bred for war, not love, that nothing could fit, that no one ever should try. Silence spread between them again, but this time it was different. Not empty, not cold. It was the kind of silence that forms when one soul quietly agrees to hold the weight of another's memory. She laughed, sharp and bitter. My first handler tried anyway. He brought tools. The medics called it an experiment. They said if they could just adjust the cavity, perhaps I could be made useful. I was unconscious for most of it. I woke up less. She glanced at him. No recoil, no revulsion. He didn't flinch. They stitched me back together, but not well. Scar tissue doesn't obey orders like skin. It tightens, pulls, reminds. Her hand moved, not consciously, toward her side. The motion was so slight, so instinctive, it almost didn't happen. But he saw it. The second one didn't ask, just tried. Said I owed it. Said a body like mine was property wasted if not used. The lamp in the corner flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across her jawline. She didn't cry. Her kind wasn't built to leak water when broken. They hardened. They grew fangs. They forgot how to want. I was strong enough to break him, she said quietly, but I didn't. I let it happen. Because I thought, maybe if I gave something, they'd stop calling me a failure. She looked at him, expecting judgment, maybe disgust. But there was only stillness. A stillness deep and unwavering, like the core of some ancient, unmoving world. They didn't stop, she whispered. Draven met her gaze. Then they never met anyone willing to grow. His voice was low, but there was something in it, something not spoken, not entirely human, something not about anatomy at all. Kazira blinked. What? Human physiology, he said, like he was talking to a classroom full of ghosts. It's not rigid. We adapt. Muscles change under stress. Bones stretch under pressure. Our reproductive systems aren't as fixed as you were led to believe. We're made to evolve, especially with someone we trust. She stared. The idea was ridiculous. And yet, even if, he continued, that weren't true, and it is what they told you wasn't about biology, it was about control. Shrink a giant enough times, she'll kneel just to feel less alone. Her fists clenched around air that wasn't choking her anymore. What are you saying? Her voice was hoarse. That you're not too much, he said. They were never enough. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. It wasn't the words. It was what they stirred. Not warmth. Not hope. Something stranger. Curiosity. Not about him, about herself. Because for the first time, she wasn't asking if she was broken. She was asking if maybe, just maybe, she had never been meant to fit into them. And maybe they weren't worthy of her. She shifted her weight, subtle, unthinking. The corner of the room didn't feel like a fortress anymore, more like an alcove carved into the edge of a new map. Uncharted, unclaimed. He didn't press. He returned to the drone, tightening the casing like they hadn't just cracked open a chasm between them. And in that silence thicker now, pulsing with new tension, she said the most dangerous thing of all. I don't know what I'm supposed to be, if not what they made me. He looked up. You get to decide. That night, as the drone softly beeped into idle and the light dimmed into gold, Kazira stood a little taller. Not because she believed him, but because she wanted to. And that was the first mutation. Not in her flesh, but in the way she held her own name. The room wasn't warm, but it felt like it should have been. The micro hearth cast a soft, trembling glow against the walls, painting them in flickers of rust, orange, and deep-shadowed gold. Not enough to chase the cold from her skin, but enough to chase it from somewhere deeper the space behind the ribs, where fear settles in silence. Draven sat cross-legged near the tiny flame, legs folded, palms open on his knees, as if he were guarding a ritual instead of waiting for sleep. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her. He just breathed in that quiet, patient rhythm she was beginning to recognize, not dominance, not command, but invitation. Kazira stood in the dimness, her figure blocking the little warmth like an eclipse. She'd been watching him for too long. The instinct to observe had long ago been weaponized into survival. But tonight, it wasn't fear that made her linger in the shadows. It was the growing pressure of not knowing what would happen if she stepped forward. Her claws twitched, curled, opened again. He made no move. That stillness, that maddening stillness, somehow louder than any speech, more dangerous than violence. She hated how it didn't demand anything from her, hated it and needed it. So she stepped out of the corner, crossing the floor slowly, cautiously, like approaching a memory that hadn't hurt yet. She stopped just short of the hearth, letting its warmth lick at her feet. He still didn't speak, didn't glance up, but she knew he saw her. She felt it. The air between them changed thicker, like breathing through water. He turned his hand just slightly, offering his palm without pushing it toward her. Not a demand, not a plea, just there. Her chest rose, slow and uncertain. Her hand lifted halfway, stopped. Claws hovered above his fingers, trembling not from weakness, but from everything she had been taught to fear. She wasn't afraid of pain. She was afraid of gentleness. Because gentleness could crumble you from the inside out. Because once you felt it, you never forgot. And God's, if he took it away, her voice broke before it fully formed. I want to try, she whispered, and even she was surprised by how soft it came out. Even if I break again. His eyes met hers, steady, warm, the kind of warmth that didn't burn it thawed. Then we'll rebuild, he said, together. She let her hand fall. Claws touched skin, not piercing, not clutching, just touched. His fingers didn't recoil. They curled around hers, gently, and that was it. No kiss, no firestorm, no claim, just touch. But it split something wide open in her. Not a wound, a door. Her breath caught, the kind that didn't shake your lungs but your beliefs. No one had ever touched her like that. Not with intention, not with care. Not like she was allowed to choose. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Because the air was no longer empty. Because the silence was no longer waiting for violence. Because for the first time, she wasn't waiting for the trap beneath the kindness. She was waiting for what came next. And whatever it was, she wanted it to be real. She let go, slowly, her hand pulling back like the tide after first contact with foreign sand. She sat across from him, not at his feet, not near the door, equal distance from the fire. Close enough to feel it, far enough not to need it. And when she finally closed her eyes, for the first time in memory, she dreamed of something that didn't hurt. It began with a whisper inside her, not a sound, but a sensation, like the echo of a memory that wasn't hers yet. She sat alone beneath the filtered skylight of the station's outer ring, where radiation danced softly against the reinforced glass, and starlight spilled in strange, violet beams. The floor was cold under her feet. The room was still, and inside her, something shifted. At first, she thought it was pain. That made sense. Pain was familiar, predictable, deserved. But this wasn't sharp. It was warm, gentle, strange. Her palm drifted, almost without thought, down to her abdomen, where her armor of flesh had always been strongest. But now there was softness, a quiet swell she hadn't noticed before. The realization struck her not like a spark but like a thunderclap. She wasn't alone. Something was growing. And in the space between heartbeats, joy bloomed wild and blinding, uncontrollable, and then collapsed into a deeper terror than she had ever known. She backed away from herself, from the thought, from the impossibility of what her body was whispering. Draven found her near the storage tanks, crouched, breath ragged, eyes wide and unfocused like she'd seen the edge of a void, and realized it stared back. He knelt beside her, silent, waiting. Her voice cracked when it finally came out. "I can feel it," she said. "It's real. It's alive." His eyes held hers, steady and warm. And then she whispered the truth she hadn't wanted to remember. "My kind, once we carry life, we're discarded. We're used up, defective, no longer efficient for function. They terminate or sell us off to lesser moons. Some are fed to predators. Some are just forgotten." She pressed her hands into her stomach like she could hide the life from the world by sheer force of will. "I can't go back there," she choked. "I can't let them take this from me." Draven moved slowly, no grand speeches, just presence. He placed his hand over hers. "Not this time," he said, "not with me." And for a brief, trembling moment, she believed him. But the galaxy does not sleep quietly. News, like rot, spreads faster when whispered. And the whispers had started. A human impregnated the giant. A monster, fertile. The market Arca Prime's underworld witched like a cut nerve. The brokers saw not scandal, but value. A new product line, a hybrid. Speculation turned to greed. Greed turned to threats. One merchant offered triple the coin for her body. Another demanded she be returned for reconditioning. One simply said, "No one wants the child. They want the data." Then came the bounty. Small at first, then bigger, then violent. Draven watched the monitors flicker red as proximity warnings lit up. Unauthorized docking, surveillance interference, weapon signatures just outside the station grid. The danger wasn't coming. It had already arrived. He turned to her. She already knew. Kazira stood tall, instinct rising in her like fire through old bones. She didn't ask if they should run. She didn't wonder if he was afraid. She asked only one thing. "Do we protect the child, or do we burn the whole market to the ground?" He didn't answer with words. He armed the ship. And for the first time since her birth, she didn't feel like a tool. She felt like a mother. And she was ready to fight for what was hers. It didn't look like war. It looked like preparation. Quiet, measured, precise. Draven moved through the cold-lit chamber like a man sealing doors on something that couldn't be undone. He checked the pulse rifle, calibrated the signal jammer, packed a detonator that hummed with enough power to shatter a hangar wall. Every movement was careful. No panic, no rage. Only resolve. Across the room, Kazira stood tall before a long-forgotten mirror, its surface fractured, but clear enough to show her who she had become. She didn't wear armor, she didn't need to. Instead, she picked up her chains. The same ones that once dragged behind her, rusted with old commands and failed escape. Now, she wrapped them across her chest, looped them around her shoulders, let them clink and coil like a serpent tamed. They would not bind her again. They would announce her. Draven turned as she stepped into view. He didn't speak. Neither did she. He offered her one nod. She returned it. And they walked. The airlock hissed. The outside greeted them with silence that pulsed with the memory of screams. The yard hadn't changed. Not yet. The rust still clung to the gates like dried blood. The posts still jutted from the ground like the teeth of some long-dead god. But something in the wind had shifted. They didn't sneak. They walked straight through the center, side by side, as if gravity itself bent around their passage. Faces turned, eyes widened, breathing paused. Then came the voice. Hers. Low, grounded, thunder-wrapped in silk. "He didn't take me." She stepped up onto the main platform, towering above them, the way she always had, only now she stood taller. "He healed me." Every word echoed through the bones of the place like prophecy. "And now I bring life." Her hand touched her belly. Not because I was forced, not because I was broken, but because I chose. In silence, true silence cracked. Not from sound, but from stillness finally letting go. Somewhere behind her, a chain snapped. It wasn't metal. It was belief. A cry rose not of pain, but recognition. And then, movement. A slave in the back tore the bracer from her wrist and let it fall like a corpse. Another shouted. Another screamed not in fear, but in fury long starved. Then the air caught fire. Chains swung like whips. Post fragments became clubs. And the first guard to lift a weapon never got the chance to use it. Kazira stepped into the chaos not to lead it, but to join it. She caught a baton mid-swing, crushed it in her grip, and hurled its wielder through the iron gate like he was weightless. Draven moved with lethal grace, firing bursts that didn't kill, but dropped men with mechanical efficiency. He opened gates, freed locks, dropped codes with the flick of a wrist. Each motion freed another body, another voice, another fury unleashed. The market burned. Not in flames, but in memory. Everything it was, all the fear, the obedience, the branding of worth shredded beneath feet that no longer bowed. No more handlers, no more collars, no more names given by men who never learned to say them. In the heart of it, Kazira climbed the central post, the highest, the first one she was ever chained to. And there where she had once been silenced, she planted the crimson banner. Stitched not from cloth, but from old bindings, torn restraints, and the fabric of her own former collar. It read in clean, brutal lettering, "No more owners." The last guard dropped his weapon, the last merchant ran. And then, it was quiet again. But not the quiet of fear. The quiet of power returned to its rightful place. Kazira stood, wind brushing against her skin, her breath steady, her hands still resting on the life inside her. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Because every woman in that yard was watching her. And every one of them now knew, you do not have to be small to be loved. You do not have to be quiet to be free. They didn't tear the market down. They remade it. With their own hands scraped, blistered, bleeding sometimes, but steady, unyielding. What once was a cage became a sanctuary. The sanctum of second hearts. Steel posts that had once held bodies in place now stood as beams for roofs that shielded not confined. The metal bindings were melted down, reforged into tools, hinges, beds with rounded corners and enough space to breathe. The same stones that had echoed with screams now caught only laughter, unsure and shy at first, but growing. No one told them what to do. That was the point. Walls weren't built to separate, but to offer privacy. Food wasn't ration, it was shared. The courtyard, once lined with auction rails, became a garden. The soil was poor, so they mixed it with ash, bone fragments, rust. From death, something green took root. Some mornings, the smell of cooked root fruit and flame-toasted starch drifted through the corridors, mingling with the distant hum of rewired solar panels. Draven worked in the far wing, surrounded by half-working tech and strange hybrids machines built from scavenged remnants and redesigned by liberated minds. He said little, but he stayed, always within reach. And Shekzira became something more than symbol. She didn't ask for it. She didn't want it. But they looked at her like she carried the map to some place none of them had ever been, a place inside their own skin. She was the first to say it out loud, that she didn't just want to survive. She wanted to feel. And the others, they started to listen. She taught them how to hold tools without fearing the crack of disapproval behind them, how to speak without bracing for correction, how to be naked and unashamed, not for pleasure, for freedom. Still, the question hung in the air, not from their mouths, but from their silence. Can we learn what she learned? That our bodies are not tools to be measured or discarded, not machines of function or failure, that they are temples capable of both destruction and divinity? The question settled in the bones of the place. It echoed when they bathed in still water for the first time without supervision, when they sang in broken tongues from homeworlds long erased, when they touched not in fear or trade but out of trust. And in the evenings, when the moons hung low and red through the skylight dome, Kazira would sometimes walk the perimeter barefoot, the cool metal floor beneath her calloused heels, grounding her to this new world she helped birth. She'd stopped by the post that once held her. It remained, intact, not as tribute, but as memory, and on its surface they carved new names. Not the ones given by masters, the ones they chose for themselves. They didn't ask all at once. It started in glances, quiet moments, the kind that stretch too long because no one wants to be the first to speak. The kind of silence that hums not from absence, but from longing. Draven had become something they didn't have a name for. Not leader, not owner, not even lover. He was proof that the impossible could exist, that there were hands that didn't bruise, eyes that didn't inventory, a voice that didn't demand obedience, but offered presence. They found him in the workshop. The night had just begun its second cycle, and the dome above glowed with fractured constellations. The women came without formation, without plan, just arrived. One stepped forward. Kirathi moss-skinned one with hands that used to tremble even when still. She didn't kneel, didn't bow. She simply asked, "Can you teach us how to feel again?" Not how to be touched, not how to be taken, but how to feel. Draven froze mid-motion. The tool in his hand stilled, its light dimming. He looked at the faces before him, some familiar, some broken in ways even words refused to name, all of them brave enough to want something more than pain. He didn't know what to say, but he didn't have to. Kazira stepped beside him. She towered, as always, but no longer alone. The weight she carried wasn't isolation, no, it was purpose. Her hand rested gently on his shoulder. "I share him," she said, and her voice didn't falter. "Not as property, not because he is mine, but because hope is not a thing you keep to yourself." The women listened not to the words, but to the truth inside them. "I was once told my body was too much," Kazira continued. "Too wide, too strong, too wrong. I believed it, until he taught me I was never too much, that the world had simply been too small to carry me." She looked down at Draven. "You taught me that healing isn't just touch, it's choice. The right to say yes, the right to say no, the right to be seen without fear." She turned back to the others. "If you're ready, he'll teach you too." Draven stood slowly, not because he was uncertain, but because the moment deserved it. "We'll start with breath," he said. "With space, with silence you don't have to fill with apologies. We'll learn how to laugh without permission, how to stop when it's too much, how to ask for more without shame. This isn't about pleasure. This is about you, about your body returning to you." No one spoke, but something moved through the group like wildfire wrapped in prayer. They formed a circle that night, not in ritual, not in ceremony, just a shape that meant together. He lit the fire at the center. It wasn't big, but it was enough. They sat around it, each woman carrying her own weight, her own ruin, her own name, or lack of one. And for the first time, none of it had to be hidden. Draven didn't lecture. He listened. They spoke. They wept. They laughed awkward at first, then real. Some touched fingertips with strangers. Some reached for the ground, steadying themselves on something that wasn't pain. Kazira didn't speak again. She just stayed close, like a shield that didn't hover, but stood watch. And in that quiet, under starlight and firelight, they began to relearn the language of being whole. Not perfect, not healed, just whole. And that was enough. They gathered beneath the fractured sky, where the moons drifted like watchful gods, scarred and solemn. The sanctum had no cathedral walls, no carved altar. But in the center, among blankets stitched from resistance and laughter, Kazira labored her breath wild, her voice low and steady, like thunder held in a cage of stars. Around her stood those once deemed unworthy, broken women, silent shadows, now reborn in fire, in voice, in choice. They formed a circle again, not to witness a spectacle, but to protect a moment. No weapons, no chains, just hands, open, steady, fiercely gentle. Draven knelt beside her. His palm never left hers, not once. She was not afraid. Not this time. Her body trembled, but it did not falter. It had once been a prison. Now it was a portal. And through it came the impossible. A child, wrapped in a warmth older than language, softer than gravity, more powerful than any empire still clawing for control beyond the stars. Half human, half Lorathi, entirely new. Kazira held her close, her chest heaving not from pain, but from awe. The others leaned forward, silently weeping, their tears falling not from sorrow, but recognition. This was what they were never meant to have. Draven looked at the tiny creature and whispered, "Nova." Kazira smiled, her tusks trembling. "Nova?" He nodded. "It means new beginning." Nova blinked, as if sensing the weight of what her birth carried. The revolution was no longer in fire, or steel. It was in her lungs, in her first breath, in her heartbeat echoing across the silence of 1,000 star systems. Draven stood, lifting Nova gently toward the starlit dome above, and as if the galaxy itself were listening, he spoke not loudly, but with truth that struck harder than war cries. In a galaxy forged by cruelty, his voice trembled, one act of kindness lit the fuse of 1,000 revolutions. The circle listened, and all it took was seeing the person behind the scars. Kazira reached for him, not because she was weak, but because they were strong together. Around them, the former slaves whispered stories to Nova, not tales of horror, but of survival, of resistance, of soft mornings and shared meals, and learning to laugh with mouths that once knew only screams. And through those stories, a new history began, not written by victors, but by the healed. Final words, almost lost in the night breeze, wrapped around the stars like a vow. In every starless place, there is still a spark waiting to ignite. Not through violence, not through vengeance, but through the quiet, stubborn flame of human empathy. And far above, in the stretch of space untouched by borders, Nova stirred her tiny fist curling toward the cosmos as if she already knew. The galaxy would never be the same. They bought her like scrap, but she gave them a legacy written in stars. What began with a single coin and a broken girl ended in fire, freedom, and the first heartbeat of a new world. Kazira was never meant to survive, let alone lead. But through the quiet defiance of one human soul, an entire galaxy learned something it had long forgotten, that empathy is the most dangerous force in the universe. She was discarded. He saw her. Together, they sparked a movement. And now, as Nova's cry echoes across systems still bound in silence, the question remains, what if the next revolution is already growing in someone no one dares to see? Subscribe, because this story doesn't end here. On Alien Chronicles, the next truth is always waiting hidden behind a scar, a whisper, or a pair of eyes not quite human. We're just getting started.